The gunshot cracked through the night air like a whip, and Grace Guthrie felt her horse rear beneath her, hooves pawing frantically at the darkness as rough hands grabbed at her saddle. She had been warned not to travel alone after sunset, but the telegram about her aunt's failing health in Carson City had sent her racing from Eureka, Nevada, without waiting for the morning stage. Now, 3 miles outside town on a road swallowed by moonless black, she understood why the shopkeeper had looked at her with such grave concern. "Easy now, miss," a voice rasped, thick with whiskey and malice. "Just hand over that bag and we'll let you pass." Grace's fingers tightened on the reins as she counted shadows. 3 men, maybe 4, surrounding her mare like wolves circling prey. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced her voice steady. "I have nothing of value, just let me through." Laughter answered her, cold and ugly. One of the men moved closer, and she caught the glint of a blade in starlight. "That's a fine horse. Fine dress, too. Reckon you got something worth our time." Her mare danced sideways, sensing the danger, and Grace felt panic rising in her throat. She had $20 sewn into her corset, her mother's silver locket, and a derringer with 2 shots in her saddlebag, but her hands were shaking too badly to reach for it. The man with the knife stepped forward again, reaching for her stirrup. "Not her. Not tonight." The words cut through the darkness with absolute authority, and Grace's head snapped toward the voice. A rider emerged from the scrub brush flanking the road, his silhouette tall and broad-shouldered against the star-scattered sky. He sat his horse like he was born to it, and even in the darkness, Grace could see the easy way his hand rested near his holster. "This ain't your business, stranger," the man with the knife snarled, but his hand had already dropped from Grace's stirrup. "I'm making it my business." The stranger walked his horse forward with deliberate slowness, and now Grace could make out more details. A dark hat pulled low, a face shadowed but angular, and something in his bearing that spoke of a man who had faced down worse than road bandits. "The lady's under my protection now. You boys best move along before this gets unpleasant. There's 4 of us and 1 of you," another bandit spoke up, but his voice carried uncertainty. "I can count just fine." The stranger's horse stopped between Grace and her attackers. "Question is, can you bleed? Because I promise you, at least 2 of you will before you lay another hand on her." The silence stretched taut as a rope about to snap. Grace held her breath, watching the bandits exchange glances. Finally, the man with the knife spat into the dirt. "She ain't worth dying for, come on, boys." They melted back into the darkness like smoke, and Grace sat frozen in her saddle, trembling from head to toe as the adrenaline drained out of her. The stranger waited until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely before turning his horse toward her. "You all right, madam?" Grace tried to answer, but her voice came out as barely a whisper. "Yes, I think so." He moved closer, and she finally got a good look at his face. Strong jaw, eyes that looked dark in the starlight, and a scar that cut through his left eyebrow. He was young, maybe 25 or 26, and something about the set of his mouth suggested he didn't smile often. "You're a long way from anywhere to be traveling alone at night." "I received word my aunt was ill. I had to get to Carson City." The words tumbled out, and Grace realized she was still shaking. "I thought I could make it to the next town before dark, but my horse threw a shoe and I had to walk her for a mile." The stranger studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Name's Dalton Ashford. I've got a camp about 2 miles east off the main road. You're welcome to rest there until first light. I'll ride with you to Sutton's Pass come morning. It's safer." Grace knew she should be wary of a stranger's offer, but something in his quiet demeanor steadied her. He had just saved her life, after all, and she wasn't foolish enough to think the bandits wouldn't circle back if she continued alone. "Grace Guthrie, and yes, thank you, I would be grateful." Dalton turned his horse and started east, and Grace followed, her mare falling into step beside his gelding. They rode in silence for a while, the only sounds the creak of leather and the soft thud of hooves on packed earth. Grace studied him from the corner of her eye, noting the way he sat easy in the saddle despite the rifle across his lap, and the vigilant way his gaze swept their surroundings. "You live out here?" she finally asked, needing to fill the silence. "When I'm working." His voice was low and rough, like gravel shifting. I run cattle from Eureka up to the railhead in Elko. Sometimes I scout for wagon trains heading west. Right now I'm tracking a pack of wild horses that's been spooking the herds. That sounds dangerous. Less dangerous than traveling alone at night on a road known for bandits. There was no judgment in his tone, just statement of fact, but Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks anyway. I know it was foolish, but my aunt raised me after my parents died. When I got the telegram, I just reacted. She paused, then added quietly, "Thank you for what you did back there. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along." Dalton was quiet for a moment. "I was tracking near the road when I heard your horse, figured someone was in trouble." He glanced at her. "You know how to use that derringer in your saddlebag?" Grace blinked in surprise. "How did you know about that?" "Saw the outline when your bag shifted. If you're going to carry it, you need to keep it where you can reach it quick. Won't do you any good buried under supplies." "I'll remember that." She studied his profile in the darkness. "Are you from Eureka originally?" "Texas. Came west 3 years ago after the war ended." His jaw tightened slightly. "Wasn't much left for me back home." Grace heard the weight of untold stories in those words and didn't press. The war had scattered men across the frontier like seeds on the wind, all of them carrying ghosts they didn't talk about. She had seen enough of them pass through her boarding house to recognize the look in their eyes. "I run a boarding house in Eureka," she offered. "If you ever need a place to stay when you're in town, we serve breakfast and dinner, clean sheets, and reasonable rates." "I'll keep that in mind." They rode on, and gradually the landscape shifted from scrubland to scattered pines. Dalton guided them off the main road onto a narrow trail that wound between rocky outcroppings, and soon Grace saw the flicker of a banked campfire in a small clearing. He had chosen his spot well, she noticed, sheltered on 3 sides by rock and with clear sightlines to anyone approaching. Dalton dismounted and reached up to help Grace down. His hands were strong and steady on her waist, and for a moment she was acutely aware of how alone they were out here. But he released her immediately and turned to tend the horses, speaking over his shoulder. "There's coffee in the pot if you want to heat it up. Bedroll by the fire is clean. You take it and I'll keep watch." "You don't have to stay awake all night," Grace protested, moving toward the fire and extending her cold hands toward the embers. "Rather not wake up to those bandits trying their luck again." He unsaddled her mare with efficient movements, checking the animal's legs and hooves. "This one needs proper shoeing before you ride her hard again. I've got spare shoes in my pack. I'll fix her up in the morning." Grace watched him work, impressed by his competence. Most men she knew would have made a bigger show of their heroism, expecting gratitude and admiration. Dalton just did what needed doing with quiet efficiency, like saving women from bandits was just another evening's work. She found a tin cup and poured herself coffee from the battered pot, wincing at the bitter strength of it. "Sorry, I make it strong," Dalton said, catching her expression. "It's perfect. I could use something strong right now." Grace wrapped both hands around the cup, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. "How long have you been camping out here?" 4 days. "Track the horses to a canyon about 6 miles north, but they're skittish. Every time I get close, they bolt." He finished with the horses and moved to the fire, adding wood until flames began to dance and crackle. "They've got a good stallion leading them. Smart. He knows these hills better than I do. Will you catch them?" "Eventually, I'm patient." He settled onto a rock across from her, pushing his hat back slightly so she could see his face better in the firelight. His eyes were brown, she saw now, dark as coffee and just as intense. "What about you? How long have you been running a boarding house?" 2 years. "My aunt left me the building when she moved to Carson City to be with her daughter. It was either run it or sell it, and I didn't want to lose the only home I've ever known." Grace stared into her coffee. "It's hard work, but I like having a place that's mine. Where I make the rules and decide who gets to stay. Doesn't sound like you get out much." "I don't. There's always something that needs doing. Cooking, cleaning, fixing what breaks." She smiled slightly. "This is actually the first time I've left Eureka in 8 months." Dalton studied her across the fire. "That's no way to live, all work and no living," says the man camping alone in the wilderness for days on end. Grace met his gaze steadily. "What do you do for living when you're not working?" His mouth quirked, almost a smile. "Fair point. Guess we're both guilty of that." He stood and moved to his saddle pack, pulling out a bundle wrapped in cloth. "You hungry? I've got jerky and some hardtack. It's not much, but it'll keep you until morning." "Thank you." Grace accepted the food, realizing she hadn't eaten since early afternoon. The jerky was tough but flavorful, and she chewed slowly, watching Dalton as he checked his rifle and then settled back onto his rock, his posture relaxed but alert. "Can I ask you something?" she said after a while. "Go ahead." "Why did you help me?" A lot of men would have just ridden on, not wanting the trouble. Dalton was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke, his voice was low. "I had a sister, Sarah. When I left Texas to come west, I had to leave her behind with our uncle. She was 18, pretty, full of dreams about moving to a city and becoming a teacher." He paused, jaw working. "Last year, she was traveling to San Antonio to visit friends. Her stage was attacked. She didn't make it." Grace's breath caught. "I'm so sorry." The men who did it were never caught. Probably moved on to some other territory, still out there doing the same thing to other women. His hands tightened into fists. "So when I heard someone in trouble tonight, I didn't think about it. I just moved. Because maybe if someone had been there for Sarah, things would have been different." The raw pain in his voice made Grace's chest ache. She set down her coffee and moved around the fire, sitting on the rock beside him. Without thinking too much about it, she placed her hand over his. "I'm sure your sister knew you cared about her, that you would have been there if you could." Dalton looked down at her hand on his, and something in his expression shifted. "I hope so. I carry that with me every day, the guilt that I wasn't there. It wasn't your fault. You couldn't have known. Doesn't make it easier." He turned his hand over, palm up, and his fingers curled gently around hers. "But helping you tonight, maybe that evens the scales a little bit. Maybe Sarah's watching somewhere, knowing I didn't let it happen again." They sat like that for a while, hands clasped, staring into the fire. Grace felt something shifting in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the flames. This man who had saved her life was carrying his own wounds, his own losses, and somehow that made her feel less alone with her own struggles. "Your aunt," Dalton said after a while. "The telegram said she was ill. Is it serious?" "I don't know. My cousin's telegram just said I should come quickly if I wanted to see her." Grace felt worry knot in her stomach again. "She's 72. She's been slowing down for a while, but I thought she had more time." "We'll get you to Sutton's Pass first thing in the morning. You can catch the stage from there to Carson City. It's faster than riding and safer." "Thank you." Grace squeezed his hand. "You've been very kind to a stranger. You're not a stranger anymore." His thumb brushed across her knuckles, a gentle movement that sent warmth up her arm. "And I like to think Sarah sent you my way. Give me a chance to do what I couldn't do for her." Grace felt tears prick her eyes, moved by his words and the gentleness in them. "Then I'm grateful to her too." "And to you." They talked through much of the night, Dalton keeping watch while Grace wrapped herself in his bedroll by the fire. She told him about growing up in Eureka, about her parents dying of fever when she was 12, about her aunt who had stepped in to raise her and teach her how to run a business. He told her about Texas, about learning to rope and ride before he could read, about the war that had taken so many of his friends and left him hollow and searching for purpose. Dawn came slowly, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Dalton was true to his word, shoeing Grace's mare with practiced efficiency while coffee boiled over the rebuilt fire. Grace watched him work, admiring the strength in his shoulders and the careful way he handled her horse, speaking softly to keep the animal calm. "You're good with horses," she observed. "Spent more time with them than people for most of my life." He finished the last nail and straightened, patting the mare's flank. "She'll carry you fine now. Should get her looked at properly when you reach Carson City, though. This is just a temporary fix." They broke camp and rode toward Sutton's Pass as the sun climbed higher, turning the landscape golden. Grace felt the events of the previous night settling into her bones with a strange mixture of fear and something else, something brighter. She kept glancing at Dalton as they rode, studying his profile, the way morning light caught in his dark hair beneath his hat. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, catching her looking. Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Just that I'm glad it was you who came along last night. I don't think I would have felt this safe with anyone else." Something flickered in his eyes and he guided his horse closer to hers. "Can I ask you something now, of course? After you see your aunt, after you settle things in Carson City, are you planning to go back to Eureka?" "Yes. The boarding house is my responsibility. I have guests depending on me." Dalton nodded slowly. "Would you mind if I stopped by sometime? When I'm in town," Grace's heart did something complicated in her chest. "I would like that very much." "Good." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, transforming his serious face. "Because I'm planning to be in town a lot more often from now on." They reached Sutton's Pass by mid-morning, a small cluster of buildings huddled around a wide spot in the road where stages changed horses. Dalton helped Grace down from her mare and walked her to the stage office, his hand resting protectively on the small of her back. Grace purchased her ticket while Dalton arranged for her horse to be stabled until she returned. "Stage leaves in an hour," the clerk said, eyeing Dalton with obvious curiosity. "Gets into Carson City by evening if we don't have trouble." Grace turned to Dalton, suddenly reluctant to say goodbye. "Thank you again for everything. I don't know how to repay you." "Don't need repayment." He took her hand, his thumb brushing across her knuckles again in that gentle way that made her skin tingle. "Just get to your aunt safe, and maybe save me a room next time I'm in Eureka." "The best room, with the window that overlooks the street." Grace smiled up at him. "It's yours whenever you want it. I'll hold you to that." He squeezed her hand, then released it with obvious reluctance. "Take care of yourself, Grace Guthrie. You too, Dalton Ashford." She watched him mount his horse and ride back toward the hills, something in her chest pulling tight as he disappeared into the distance. The stage ride to Carson City passed in a blur, Grace's mind replaying every moment of the previous night and morning, every word they had exchanged, the feel of his hand in hers. Her aunt's house was a small adobe structure on the outskirts of Carson City, surrounded by struggling rose bushes and a white picket fence. Grace's cousin, Margaret, met her at the door with red-rimmed eyes. "Oh, Grace, I'm so glad you're here. Mama's been asking for you." Margaret led her inside to a dim bedroom where her aunt lay propped up on pillows, looking smaller and frailer than Grace remembered. "Gracie girl," her aunt whispered, reaching out a trembling hand. "You came." "Of course I came." Grace took her aunt's hand, settling onto the chair beside the bed. "How are you feeling?" "Tired, so tired." Her aunt's eyes searched Grace's face. "But I'm glad you're here. I have things to tell you, things I need you to know before I go." "Don't talk like that. You're going to be fine." "Hush now, let an old woman speak her piece." Her aunt's grip tightened with surprising strength. "I've lived a good life, Gracie. I married a man I loved, raised a good daughter, and had the joy of raising you too after your mama passed. I have no regrets." Grace felt tears sliding down her cheeks. "You gave me everything. I don't know what I would have done without you. You would have survived. You're strong like your mama." Her aunt smiled. "But I want to tell you something important. Don't do what I did, hiding away from life because you're afraid. You run that boarding house like it's a fortress, keeping everyone at arm's length. It's no way to live, sweetness." The words hit too close to home, echoing what Dalton had said the night before. "I'm not hiding, I'm just busy." "You're protecting yourself. I understand why after losing your parents so young, but life is meant to be lived, not just survived." Her aunt squeezed her hand. "Promise me you'll open your heart. Let someone in. Find love even if it scares you." Grace thought about Dalton, about the way her heart had raced when he smiled at her, the safety she felt in his presence. "I'll try, Aunt Clara, I promise." "Good girl." Her aunt's eyes drifted closed. "Now tell me what's been happening in Eureka. I want to hear everything." Grace stayed in Carson City for 5 days, helping Margaret care for her aunt and putting the older woman's affairs in order. Aunt Clara rallied somewhat, gaining enough strength to sit up and take meals, though the doctor cautioned that her heart was weak and failing. On the 6th day, she slipped away peacefully in her sleep, Margaret and Grace at her bedside. The funeral was small but well attended. Aunt Clara had been beloved in Carson City, known for her kindness and sharp wit. Grace stood at the graveside with Margaret, accepting condolences from neighbors and friends, her heart heavy but grateful she had made it in time to say goodbye. "What will you do now?" Margaret asked that evening as they sorted through their mother's belongings. Go back to Eureka. The boarding house has been closed for almost a week. I need to get back to my guests. Grace folded one of her aunt's shawls, pressing it to her face to breathe in the familiar lavender scent. What about you? Henry and I will stay here. His work is here and this is home. Margaret paused. But you're always welcome, Grace, your family. I know, thank you. Grace hugged her cousin. I'll write often and I'll visit when I can. The stage ride back to Sutton's Pass was somber, Grace lost in her thoughts and memories. She collected her mare from the stables and made the ride to Eureka in bright afternoon sunshine, her heart both heavy with loss and strangely light with possibility. Her aunt's words echoed in her mind with every mile. Open your heart, let someone in. Eureka welcomed her back with its familiar dusty streets and scattered buildings, the boarding house standing 3 stories tall at the corner of Main and Silver Street. Grace stabled her horse and let herself in through the back door, setting down her bags with a sigh of relief to be home. Miss Guthrie, you're back. Her neighbor, Mrs. Chen, appeared in the doorway with a basket of eggs. I've been keeping an eye on things like you asked. No problems. How is your aunt? She passed away 3 days ago. Grace managed a smile despite the ache in her chest. But peacefully with family around her. Thank you for watching over the house. Oh, honey, I'm so sorry. Mrs. Chen set down the eggs and pulled Grace into a hug. You let me know if you need anything, you hear? I'll bring over some soup tomorrow. Grace spent the rest of the day cleaning and airing out the boarding house, opening windows and sweeping floors, taking comfort in familiar routines. By evening, she was exhausted but satisfied, sitting on her front porch with a cup of tea and watching the sun paint the mountains gold. Excuse me, madam, I'm looking for a room. Grace looked up and her heart stuttered. Dalton stood at the bottom of her porch steps, hat in his hands, dust on his boots, and a tentative smile on his face. You came back. The words came out breathless. Told you I would. He climbed the steps slowly. Caught those wild horses yesterday, sold them to a rancher this morning, figured I'd earned a few days in a real bed. His expression sobered. How's your aunt? She passed away. Grace set down her tea and stood, but I got to say goodbye. She was ready to go, I think, tired of fighting. I'm sorry, Grace. Thank you, she smiled despite the tears threatening. And yes, I have a room for you, the one I promised, with the window overlooking the street. Much obliged. But he didn't move, just stood there looking at her with those dark eyes. Truth is, I didn't come just for a room. No, he took a step closer. I've been thinking about you every day since we parted, couldn't get you out of my mind. The way you looked in firelight, the sound of your voice, how right your hand felt in mine. Another step. I know it's fast, maybe too fast, but I want to see where this goes, you and me, if you're willing. Grace's heart was racing now, her aunt's words ringing in her ears. Open your heart. Let someone in. I've been thinking about you two every single day. Dalton's face transformed with a smile, and suddenly he was close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. Yeah. Grace reached up and touched his face, feeling the rough stubble on his jaw. Stay, Dalton, not just for a few days. Stay and let's figure this out together. Nothing I'd like more. He covered her hand with his, turning his face to press a kiss to her palm. I don't have much, just my horse, my gear, and whatever work I can find. But I'm a hard worker and I'll treat you right, that's a promise. I don't need much, just honesty and kindness. Grace rose on her toes, her other hand finding his shoulder, and maybe a few more of those smiles. You don't do it often enough. Stick around and I'll smile plenty. He lowered his head, his breath warm against her lips. Can I kiss you, Grace? Yes, she breathed, and then his mouth was on hers, gentle and sure and perfect. Grace melted into him, her hands sliding up to curl around his neck as he pulled her closer. The kiss was everything she had dreamed about during lonely nights in Carson City, sweet and deep and full of promise. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Dalton rested his forehead against hers. I'm going to court you proper. Take you to dinner, walk you home under the stars, do all the things a woman deserves. I'd like that. Grace smiled against his jaw. But right now, let's just go inside. You must be exhausted and I should feed you. When was the last time you ate something that wasn't jerky or hardtack? Can't remember. He followed her inside, his hand finding hers and holding tight. Lead the way, Miss Guthrie. Over the following weeks, Dalton became a fixture in Eureka and in Grace's life. He took a job at the livery stable, working with horses and earning enough to pay for his room at the boarding house, though Grace would have let him stay free. True to his word, he courted her properly, taking her to the restaurant on Main Street, walking with her in the evenings, sitting on her porch and talking until the stars came out. The other boarders quickly accepted him, charmed by his quiet competence and the way he helped around the house without being asked. He fixed the broken step on the back stairs, replaced rotting boards on the porch, and taught Grace how to properly clean and load her derringer, insisting she keep it somewhere accessible. "The world's not getting any safer," he told her one afternoon as they practiced in the yard behind the house. "I need to know you can protect yourself when I'm not here. You planning on going somewhere?" Grace asked, sighting down the barrel at the tin cans lined up on a fence post. "Not if I can help it, but work might take me away sometimes and I need to know you'll be all right." He stood behind her, adjusting her grip. "Now, gentle squeeze, don't jerk the trigger." The gun kicked in her hand and the can flew off the post. Grace laughed with delight. "I did it? Knew you could." Dalton turned her in his arms, smiling down at her. "You're stronger than you think, Grace Guthrie. I'm starting to believe that." She reached up to kiss him, and he responded eagerly, his arms tightening around her waist. They had been careful to maintain propriety, both aware of the scrutiny that came with living in a small town. But there were stolen moments like this, kisses in the backyard or on evening walks, hands clasped under the table at dinner, heated glances across rooms that promised more. 3 months after Dalton first arrived at her boarding house, he asked her to marry him. It wasn't fancy or elaborate, just the two of them sitting on her porch at sunset, his hand wrapped around hers. "I love you, Grace," he said simply. "I loved you from that first night when you looked at me with such trust despite everything you'd just been through. I love your strength, your kindness, the way you build a home not just with walls but with your heart." He pulled a simple gold ring from his pocket. "It was my mother's. She'd want you to have it. Will you marry me?" Grace felt tears streaming down her face, but they were happy tears, joyful tears. "Yes, yes, Dalton, I'll marry you." He slipped the ring on her finger and pulled her into his arms, kissing her deeply while the sun set behind them in brilliant shades of orange and pink. When they finally broke apart, both laughing and crying, Grace rested her head against his chest and listened to the steady beat of his heart. "When?" she asked. "Whenever you want. Tomorrow, if you'll have me," Grace laughed. "Let's give it at least a few weeks. I want to do it right. Invite Margaret and her family, have a real celebration. Whatever makes you happy." He kissed the top of her head. "I just want to call you my wife." They married on a crisp October morning in the small church at the edge of Eureka. Grace in a simple white dress she had sewn herself and Dalton in his best suit, his hair slicked back and his face clean shaven. Margaret had traveled from Carson City with her husband and children, and what seemed like half the town crowded into the pews to witness their vows. "Do you, Dalton Ashford, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward?" "I do." Dalton's voice was steady, his eyes locked on Grace's. "And do you, Grace Guthrie, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward?" "I do." Grace smiled through happy tears. "Then by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife." "You may kiss your bride." Dalton pulled her close and kissed her thoroughly, not caring that everyone was watching, and the church erupted in cheers and applause. They walked down the aisle together, hand in hand, Grace's heart so full she thought it might burst. The reception was held at the boarding house, tables set up in the backyard and laden with food contributed by neighbors and friends. There was music and dancing, laughter and toasts, and through it all, Dalton kept Grace close, his arm around her waist or his hand clasped in hers. "Happy," he murmured in her ear as they swayed to a waltz, "happier than I ever thought possible." Grace looked up at him, at this man who had saved her life and then given her a reason to truly live it. "I love you so much. Love you too, more than words can say." He kissed her softly. "Thank you for taking a chance on a dusty cowboy. Thank you for seeing me as more than just a boarding housekeeper." She rested her head on his shoulder. "We're going to have a good life together." "The best," he agreed. As evening fell and guests began to drift away, Margaret pulled Grace aside with tears in her eyes. Mama would be so happy for you. She knew, you know. That day before she died, after you left the room, she told me you'd found someone. She could see it in your eyes. She was right. She told me to open my heart, and I did. Grace hugged her cousin. Thank you for coming all this way. Wouldn't have missed it for the world. Margaret wiped her eyes. You deserve this happiness, Grace. Enjoy every moment. That night, in the privacy of Grace's room that was now their room, Dalton carried her over the threshold with a grin. Always wanted to do that. Grace laughed, her arms around his neck. Well, don't drop me now. Never. He set her down gently, his hands coming up to frame her face. I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret choosing me. I could never regret this. Grace reached up to remove the pins from her hair, letting it fall around her shoulders. You're the best thing that ever happened to me. His eyes darkened as he watched her hair tumble down. You're beautiful, do you know that? Not just on the outside, though God knows you're lovely, but inside where it matters. Grace felt heat flood her cheeks. Kiss me, husband, with pleasure, wife. He captured her mouth in a searing kiss, and Grace melted into him, giving herself over to sensation and emotion and the deep certainty that this was right. This was meant to be. They made love slowly, carefully, Dalton gentle and patient as he introduced Grace to pleasures she had only imagined. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the darkness, her head on his chest, his fingers tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. Are you all right? He asked softly. Perfect. Grace smiled against his skin. Absolutely perfect. Good. He kissed her forehead. Get some sleep, love. Tomorrow starts the rest of our lives. The months that followed were the happiest Grace had ever known. She and Dalton fell into an easy rhythm, running the boarding house together, him taking odd jobs around town while she managed the cooking and cleaning. But unlike before, when the work had felt isolating, now it felt like partnership. They made decisions together, laughed together, faced challenges as a team. Dalton proved to be a natural host, charming guests with his quiet competence and willingness to help with anything they needed. The boarding house's reputation grew, and soon Grace found herself turning away customers for lack of space. She and Dalton discussed expanding, maybe buying the building next door and connecting them. We could add 6 more rooms, Grace said one evening as they sat together going over accounts. Maybe put in a proper dining room instead of using the kitchen. That's a lot of work, Dalton pointed out, and expense, but we're doing so well, and I think it would pay off in the long run. Grace looked at him hopefully. What do you think? I think you're brilliant and I trust your judgment. He pulled her onto his lap, nuzzling her neck. Let's do it. They spent the winter planning and saving, and when spring arrived, construction began. It was chaotic and dusty and occasionally frustrating, but Grace had never been happier. She worked alongside Dalton and the hired builders, painting walls and hanging curtains, choosing furniture and arranging rooms. The expanded boarding house opened in early summer to much fanfare, and within a week, every room was booked. Grace stood in the new dining room with Dalton, surveying their handiwork with satisfaction. We did it, she said, leaning against him. You did it, I just helped. He wrapped his arms around her from behind. I'm so proud of you, couldn't have done it without you. Grace turned in his arms. You know that, right? You make me braver, stronger, you make me believe I can do anything. That's just you seeing what was always there. He kissed her softly, but I'm glad I get to be here to watch you shine. In August, Grace realized she had missed her monthly courses twice. She waited another week to be sure before telling Dalton, nervous about his reaction. They had talked about children in abstract terms, but never seriously planned for them. She found him in the stable behind the boarding house, brushing down his horse. Dalton, can we talk? Always. He set down the brush and gave her his full attention. What's wrong? You look pale. Nothing's wrong, at least I don't think so. Grace took a deep breath. I'm pregnant. Dalton's eyes went wide. For a long moment he just stared at her and Grace felt panic starting to rise. Then his face broke into the biggest smile she had ever seen, and he let out a whoop of joy that startled the horse. We're having a baby. He swept her up in his arms, spinning her around. Grace, that's incredible. You're happy. Relief flooded through her. Happy, I'm over the moon. He set her down carefully, his hands coming to rest on her still flat stomach. We're going to be parents, you and me. You and me, Grace echoed, covering his hands with hers. Are you scared, terrified, he admitted, but also excited? I want to do this with you, Grace. I want to build a family with you. Good, because we're doing this whether we're ready or not, she laughed, feeling giddy. A baby, Dalton, we're having a baby. The pregnancy was difficult at first, Grace plagued by morning sickness that lasted well into the afternoon. Dalton was endlessly patient, holding her hair back when she was sick, bringing her crackers and weak tea, taking over more of the boarding house duties so she could rest. As she moved into her second trimester and the sickness faded, she regained her energy and threw herself back into work, though Dalton watched her like a hawk to make sure she didn't overdo it. I'm pregnant, not fragile, she protested when he insisted on carrying heavy things for her. I know. But humor me, he kissed her forehead. I want you and the baby healthy. Grace couldn't argue with that, so she let him fuss and tried not to be annoyed when he hovered. In truth, she loved how attentive he was, how his face lit up every time he felt the baby move, how he talked to her belly at night, telling their child stories about the Wild West and promising to teach them to ride. What if it's a girl? Grace asked one night. Will you still teach her to ride? Absolutely. Girls need to know how to handle a horse just as much as boys. Dalton pressed a kiss to her rounded stomach. Our daughter will be able to do anything she sets her mind to. And if it's a boy, same thing. I want our kids to be strong and capable, whatever their gender. He looked up at her, like their mother. In March, as winter was loosening its grip on Nevada and the first signs of spring appeared in the valley, Grace went into labor. It was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day, Dalton at her side the entire time, holding her hand and whispering encouragement. You can do this, love. You're the strongest person I know, just a little longer. Grace was exhausted and pain-racked, but she pushed through, drawing strength from Dalton's presence and the knowledge that soon she would hold their child. Finally, as afternoon sunlight streamed through the window, a baby's cry filled the room. It's a boy, the midwife announced, placing the squalling infant on Grace's chest. Healthy lungs on this one. Grace looked down at her son, red-faced and furious, and felt her heart expand in ways she hadn't known were possible. Hello, little one, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. We've been waiting for you. Dalton leaned over them both, his own eyes wet. He's perfect. Grace, he's absolutely perfect. He has your nose, Grace observed, touching the baby's tiny features. And my eyes, I think. What should we name him? Dalton asked, stroking the baby's downy hair. They had discussed names endlessly but never settled on anything. Now, looking at her son, Grace knew exactly what felt right. Daniel, after my father, Daniel Thomas Ashford. Daniel, Dalton tested the name and nodded. It's perfect. Hello, Daniel. I'm your papa, and I'm going to do my best by you. That's a promise. Little Daniel Ashford proved to be a spirited baby with strong opinions about when he wanted to eat and sleep. Grace was exhausted those first few weeks, stumbling through days in a haze of feedings and diaper changes and trying to keep the boarding house running. Dalton stepped up magnificently, taking over most of the daily operations and spending his evenings walking a fussy Daniel so Grace could sleep. You're a natural, she told him one night, watching him pace their room with their son against his shoulder, humming softly, just doing what needs doing. But he looked pleased by the compliment. Go to sleep, love, I've got him. As Daniel grew, he proved to be a curious and active child, crawling early and constantly getting into everything. Grace found herself chasing after him more often than not, amazed at how much trouble one small person could create. But she loved every exhausting minute of it, loved watching Dalton with their son, teaching him to clap his hands and make silly faces. When Daniel was 18 months old, Grace discovered she was pregnant again. This time the news was met with laughter and a slightly panicked excitement. 2 under 3 years old, Dalton said, shaking his head. We're going to have our hands full. We already have our hands full, Grace pointed out. What's one more beautiful piece of the life we're building together? He pulled her close, careful of her stomach where Daniel was squirming between them. I love our family, Grace. I love you. I love you too, so much. She kissed him over their son's head. Thank you for giving me this, all of it. Their second child, a daughter they named Charlotte, arrived in early fall, her birth much easier than Daniel's had been. She was a calm, sweet baby who slept through the night almost immediately and seemed content to simply observe the chaos around her with wide, serious eyes. "She's going to be the steady one," Dalton predicted, cradling his daughter while Daniel bounced excitedly beside him, wanting to see his sister. "Gentle Daniel," Grace instructed as their son reached out to touch Charlotte's tiny hand. "She's very small." "Baby," Daniel declared proudly. "My baby. That's right, your sister." Grace watched her family with a full heart. 2 beautiful children, a husband who loved her beyond measure, a home and business that thrived. It was more than she had ever dreamed possible that night on the dark road when Dalton had ridden to her rescue. The years passed in a blur of activity and growth. The boarding house continued to prosper, requiring them to hire additional help to manage the load. Daniel grew into a bright, energetic boy who loved horses as much as his father, while Charlotte proved to be bookish and thoughtful, happy to spend hours with her nose in a story. When Daniel was 7 and Charlotte 5, Grace and Dalton added a third child to their family, another son they named William, who seemed to inherit the best qualities of both his siblings. Dalton had long since given up his work at the livery stable to focus full-time on the boarding house, though he still took on occasional guide work for wagon trains or cattle drives when the money was particularly good. But he always came home to Grace and their children, often bringing stories of his adventures and small gifts for everyone. "Papa's back," the cry would go up, and all 3 children would rush to greet him, climbing over each other to be picked up and hugged. Grace would stand back and watch, her heart full to bursting at the sight of her family. Dalton would catch her eye over the children's heads and smile, that special smile he reserved just for her, the one that still made her stomach flip after all these years. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Dalton took Grace on a camping trip, just the 2 of them, leaving the children with Margaret, who had come to visit. He brought her back to the spot where they had spent that first night together, the clearing in the rocks where he had kept watch and she had told him about her boarding house. "Remember this?" he asked as they sat by the fire, her head on his shoulder. "Of course I remember." "This is where I started falling in love with you." Grace tilted her face up to his. "Where you told me about Sarah and I realized you were more than just a cowboy who saved me." "I was already halfway in love with you by then," Dalton confessed. "The way you held yourself together after being so scared, the determination in your eyes when you talked about your home, I knew you were special. We've built something good, haven't we?" Grace looked around at the familiar landscape. "A life neither of us expected but both of us needed." "The best life." He pulled out a small wrapped package from his saddlebag. "I got you something." Grace unwrapped it to find a beautiful silver locket on a delicate chain. She opened it to find 2 tiny photographs inside, one of their wedding day and one of their 3 children. "Oh, Dalton." "It's beautiful." She felt tears prick her eyes as she fastened it around her neck. "I'll never take it off. Good, because you and those kids, you're my whole world." He cupped her face in his hands. "Thank you, Grace, for saying yes that first day when I asked to walk you to the stage. For trusting me enough to let me court you, for marrying me and building this life with me. You've given me everything I never knew I wanted." "You saved my life," Grace said simply. "Not just that night on the road, but in every way that matters. You taught me it was okay to love, to trust, to dream bigger than the 4 walls of a boarding house. You gave me a family and a partnership and a love I never thought I'd have." They kissed in the firelight, and later made love under the stars like they had done on their wedding night, reaffirming vows and promises that had only grown stronger with time. The next morning, as they packed up camp to ride back to Eureka, Grace looked at the spot where Dalton had said those fateful words 10 years ago. Not her, not tonight. 4 words that had changed her entire life, spoken by a man who couldn't walk away from someone in need. "What are you thinking about?" Dalton asked, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. "Just how lucky I am," Grace said, leaning back against him. "That you were in the right place at the right time, that you cared enough to help a stranger. Wasn't luck, was fate." He kissed her temple. "You were always meant to be mine, and I was always meant to find you. Everything else was just the universe making sure we got to where we needed to be. I like that." Grace turned in his arms to kiss him properly. Fate brought us together and love kept us here. And it always will, Dalton promised. Always. They rode back to Eureka together, hand in hand when the trail allowed it, talking and laughing and planning for the future. Their children met them at the door, all three talking at once about everything that had happened while they were gone, and Grace and Dalton exchanged amused glances over their heads. That evening, after the children were in bed and the boarding house had settled into quiet, Grace and Dalton sat on their porch watching the stars come out. It was their favorite time of day, these peaceful moments together after the chaos of running a business and raising a family. "Do you ever miss it?" Grace asked. "The freedom of the open range, no responsibilities except yourself." Dalton was quiet for a moment, considering. "Sometimes I miss the simplicity of it, but I wouldn't trade this for anything. You, the kids, our home, our life together, this is what I was looking for all those years. I just didn't know it." "Me too." Grace laced her fingers through his. "I thought I was content running the boarding house alone, keeping the world at arm's length, but you showed me what I was missing. Connection, partnership, love, a family of my own." "Our aunt knew," Dalton said, "what she told you before she died about opening your heart. She saw what you needed even before you did. She was a wise woman." Grace smiled at the memory. "I wish she could have seen all this. Met you and the children, seen how happy I am." "I think she knows," Dalton said softly. "Wherever she is, I think she's watching and smiling." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the sounds of evening settling around them. A dog barking in the distance, the murmur of voices from the boarding house as guests settled in for the night, the soft whisper of wind through the eaves. "I want to teach Daniel to track this summer," Dalton said eventually. "He's old enough now, and he's been asking about coming with me on the short jobs. He'd love that." Grace thought about their eldest son, so eager to follow in his father's footsteps. "But not too far from town. I don't think my heart could take worrying about both of you. Just overnight trips, nothing dangerous. I'll keep him safe, I promise." Dalton squeezed her hand. "What about Charlotte? Has she said anything more about wanting to be a teacher? She mentions it constantly. I think we should look into sending her to the school in Carson City in a few years." "She's so bright, Dalton. She deserves the chance to pursue it." Grace paused. "Would you be all right with that, her being away? If it's what she wants and what's best for her, then yes." Dalton's voice was firm despite the emotion Grace could hear beneath. "I want all our children to chase their dreams, whatever they are. Even if those dreams take them away from Eureka, even then. Though I hope at least one of them wants to take over the boarding house eventually." He grinned. "All this work expanding it would be nice to keep it in the family." Grace laughed. "William might. He loves helping out, organizing the supplies and making sure everything is in its place." "He's got your head for business," Dalton agreed, "but we'll let them decide when they're older. No pressure. More silence, peaceful and content." Grace rested her head on Dalton's shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of him, leather and soap and something uniquely his own. After all these years, he still made her heart race, still made her feel safe and loved and cherished. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" "For choosing me. For staying, for building this life with me." Dalton tilted her face up to his eyes warm in the lamplight spilling from the window. "Grace Ashford, loving you and being loved by you is the greatest honor of my life. I choose you again every single day for the rest of our lives." He kissed her then, sweet and deep, and Grace lost herself in the familiar taste of him, the solid warmth of his body against hers. This was home. Not the building or the town, but this man, this love they had built together from that first frightening night on a dark road. When they finally pulled apart, both smiling, Grace said, "I choose you too, every single day, forever." "Forever sounds good to me." They stayed on the porch until late, talking about everything and nothing, making plans and sharing memories, simply enjoying being together. Eventually, the chill of the desert night drove them inside, and they climbed the stairs to their room, passing the doors where their children slept peacefully. In their own room, they undressed slowly, taking their time, hands gentle and familiar on each other's bodies. Making love after 10 years of marriage was different from those early, desperate couplings, but no less intense. It was deeper now, richer, layered with trust and knowledge and the accumulated weight of shared history. Afterward, tangled together in their bed, Dalton traced patterns on Grace's bare shoulder like he always did. "I love you," he murmured into her hair. "I love you too." Grace smiled against his chest, already half asleep. Always. The years continued to pass, bringing changes and challenges, but also joys and triumphs. Daniel grew tall and strong, learning everything his father could teach him about horses and tracking and surviving in the wilderness. He was gentle and kind despite his strength, with his mother's compassion and his father's quiet confidence. At 19, he fell in love with a rancher's daughter named Sarah, named for Dalton's sister, and they married in the same church where Grace and Dalton had exchanged their own vows. Charlotte pursued her dream of teaching, attending school in Carson City, and then returning to Eureka to open a small schoolhouse. She was patient and dedicated, beloved by her students and respected by the community. At 23, she married a banker from Virginia City, a kind man who supported her work and never asked her to give up teaching. William, true to Grace's prediction, took over managing the boarding house when he turned 21, showing a natural aptitude for business and hospitality. He expanded their services further, adding a restaurant that became popular with travelers and townspeople alike. He married late, at 28, to a widow with 2 young children who he loved like his own. Through it all, Grace and Dalton remained the steady center of their growing family. They were the ones everyone came to for advice, for comfort, for celebration. Their home was always open, their table always had room for one more, their love was a constant that never wavered. On their 30th anniversary, surrounded by children and grandchildren, Grace looked across the crowded dining room at Dalton and felt the same flutter in her heart that she had felt that first night by the campfire. He caught her eye and smiled, and she knew he felt it too. The magic between them hadn't faded with time. If anything, it had grown stronger, deeper, more essential. Speech. Someone called out, and the room fell quiet as everyone turned to look at Grace and Dalton expectantly. Dalton stood, pulling Grace up beside him, his arm around her waist. 30 years ago, I was a lonely cowboy tracking wild horses through the Nevada hills. I thought I knew what my life would be. Solitary, simple, focused on the work. Then one night, I heard a woman in trouble and everything changed. He looked down at Grace, his eyes soft. I rode in thinking I was saving her. Turns out she saved me. Grace gave me a home, a purpose, a family. She showed me what love really means. Not the easy, surface kind, but the deep, lasting kind that weathers storms and celebrates sunshine. The kind that builds something beautiful out of nothing but hope and hard work. Grace felt tears streaming down her face as Dalton continued. We've had our challenges over the years. Sickness, financial worries, the normal struggles of raising children and running a business. But we faced everything together, and that made all the difference. I'm a better man because of her. I'm a lucky man because she chose me. He raised his glass. To Grace, the love of my life, my partner in everything, the woman who turned a dusty cowboy into a husband and father. I'd do it all again in a heartbeat, just for the privilege of loving you. To Grace, the room chorused, glasses raising, and Grace had to wipe her eyes before she could speak. I don't have prepared words like my eloquent husband, she said, her voice shaking slightly. But I want to say that everything good in my life came from one decision. When Dalton offered me shelter that first night, I chose to trust him, and that trust led to love, which led to marriage, which led to this. She gestured at the room full of family. All of you. This beautiful, chaotic, wonderful family. She turned to Dalton. You say I saved you, but you saved me first, not just from those bandits, though that certainly helped. But from a life half lived, from loneliness disguised as independence, from closing myself off from the best things life has to offer. You taught me how to love fully, to dream big, to build something lasting. Everything I am, everything we have, started because you were in the right place at the right time and you cared enough to help. Thank you, Dalton, for everything, for always. She kissed him to thunderous applause, and the celebration continued late into the night, full of laughter and music and the warmth of family. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Grace found herself on the porch again with Dalton, just like they had done thousands of times over the years. 30 years, she marveled. How did that happen so fast? No idea. Feels like yesterday you were stepping onto the stage at Sutton's Pass, and I was trying to figure out how to convince you to let me see you again. Dalton pulled her close. Best decision I ever made, following my instincts that night. Best choice I ever made, pursuing you. Best choice I ever made was letting you catch me, Grace smiled up at him. Though I don't think I ever really had a choice, I was yours from that first moment, I just didn't know it yet. Fate, Dalton said, echoing his words from years ago, we were always meant to find each other. They stood together watching the stars, older now but no less in love, their hands clasped tight and their hearts beating in sync. The boarding house rose behind them, full of memories and still welcoming guests after all these years. Their children were building their own lives, their own families, carrying forward the lessons of love and dedication they had learned from their parents. It was a good life, a beautiful life. The kind of life Grace had never imagined possible that terrifying night on a dark road when she had been attacked and afraid and certain her luck had run out. But then Dalton Ashford had ridden out of the darkness and said 4 words that changed everything. Not her, not tonight. Not her because he wouldn't let them hurt her. Not tonight because he was there to make sure she survived. 4 simple words that had led to 30 years of love, of partnership, of building something beautiful together. What are you thinking about? Dalton asked, his voice rumbling against her back where she leaned against him. Just that I'm grateful, Grace said. For you, for our family, for every moment we've had together, even the hard ones. Especially the hard ones because those are when I learned just how strong we are together. We've had a good run, Dalton agreed, and we've got a lot more years ahead of us. I'm not done with you yet, Grace Ashford. Good, because I'm not done with you either. She turned in his arms to face him. I love you, Dalton, more now than ever, if that's even possible. It's possible. Because I feel the same way. He kissed her forehead, her nose, her lips. You're my everything, Grace. Always have been, always will be. They stayed on the porch until the stars began to fade, talking and dreaming and simply being together. When they finally went inside and climbed the stairs to their room, they were still holding hands, still connected in all the ways that mattered. In their bed, wrapped in each other's arms, Grace felt complete peace. This was what her aunt had wanted for her. This love, this partnership, this beautiful life built on trust and dedication and choosing each other every single day. Thank you, she whispered into the darkness. For what? Dalton's voice was sleepy but content. For riding to my rescue, for seeing me, for loving me. Grace kissed his jaw. For giving me everything. Thank you for letting me. His arms tightened around her. Sleep now, love. We've got tomorrow and all the tomorrows after to keep being grateful for each other. Grace smiled and let her eyes close, Dalton's heartbeat steady beneath her ear. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new moments to treasure. But tonight she was exactly where she belonged, in the arms of the man who had saved her life in every way that mattered, and then spent 3 decades proving that love could heal anything, build anything, survive anything. She had been attacked on the road at night, afraid and alone. The cowboy had said, not her, not tonight, and changed her destiny forever. Everything that came after the love, the family, the life they built together, all of it started with his choice to help and her choice to trust. And neither of them had ever regretted it for a single moment.